Lawyer and his family mock his wife for her job, but she reveals something that leaves them speechless. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Emma adjusted her apron, the faint smell of finger paints and chalk dust clinging to her as she gathered her bag. Another day as a kindergarten teacher had come to an end, and while her job filled her heart, it also weighed on her shoulders. It wasn't the children, their laughter, or their endless curiosity. It was the judgment that came most painfully from her own husband, Richard. Richard Bennett was a high-profile corporate lawyer, the kind who spoke in curt tones and carried the confidence of someone who believed the world should bend to his will. He'd made no secret of his disdain for Emma's career. His snide comments began as little jabs, but over time, they had turned into something sharper, cutting deeper. His family was no different. Condescending smiles and dismissive remarks were their specialty at every family gathering. "That's sweet," Richard's mother, Diane, had once said with a tight smile when Emma shared a story about a child learning to tie their shoes. "But don't you ever wish you had, more ambition?" The words echoed in Emma's mind as she drove home that evening. She had long learned to smile and deflect their barbs, but the pain was harder to ignore. Richard, despite his brilliant legal mind, seemed blind to the idea that success could be measured by something other than a paycheck or a corner office. That night, at the Bennett family dinner, the air was thick with tension. Richard's father, Gerald, leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of wine as he spoke. "Emma," Gerald began, his tone patronizing, "I always wonder how someone as bright as you settled for a job like that. Surely Richard could have helped you get into something more fitting." Laughter rippled across the table, but Emma kept her expression neutral. "I find it fulfilling," she replied, her voice steady. "Teaching young minds is a privilege." "Yes, well," Diane cut in, "it's not exactly a career that builds empires, is it?" Emma's fingers tightened around her fork, but she forced a smile. "Not everyone measures success by the size of an empire." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, Emma. They're just saying you've got potential. Maybe it's time to think bigger." It wasn't the first time he'd said something like that, and Emma knew it wouldn't be the last. But tonight, something inside her shifted. The glint in her eyes went unnoticed as she quietly returned to her meal. What Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Emma had been thinking bigger. Years ago, her late father had left her a sizable inheritance, instructing her to use it wisely. At first, she had kept it a secret, not wanting it to change the dynamic of her marriage. But as Richard's arrogance grew, so did her resolve. She had taken her father's advice to heart, seeking out investments that aligned with her values and her vision for the future. One of those investments, ironically, was Richard's law firm. It had started small, an anonymous contribution during a financial slump. She had framed it as a way to protect their shared future, but as the firm's struggles deepened, she continued to invest, gradually acquiring more and more shares. By the time Richard's partners realized the extent of her involvement, it was too late. Emma controlled the majority stake, but she had chosen to remain silent for now. She had watched from the shadows as the firm grew, relishing the quiet power she held. It wasn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about reclaiming her narrative, about reminding herself that her worth wasn't tied to their approval. As the weeks went by, the Bennett family's mockery continued. Emma endured their laughter and their snide remarks with quiet grace, all the while knowing the truth that would one day leave them speechless. One evening, Richard came home with a look of frustration etched across his face. He tossed his briefcase onto the couch and sighed heavily. "The firm's finances are a mess," he muttered. "We need a major investor, or we're looking at layoffs." Emma's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression calm. "Isn't there anyone interested?" "Not yet," Richard grumbled. "But I'm meeting with a potential investor tomorrow. They've been very quiet about their identity, but if this deal goes through, it could save us." Emma nodded, her stomach swirling with anticipation. She knew exactly who that investor was. The next day, Emma watched Richard leave for his meeting, oblivious to the storm that was about to upend his world. She took a deep breath, her resolve solidifying. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. As she prepared to step into the role she had been quietly building for years, she thought of all the times she had been dismissed, underestimated, and belittled. This was no longer about proving them wrong. This was about proving to herself that she had always been more than they could see. With a steady hand, Emma picked up her phone and dialed a number. "It's time," she said. The day of Richard's meeting had finally arrived. He stood in the sleek glass-walled conference room of his law firm, his suit impeccably tailored and his demeanor cool but determined. The firm's survival hung in the balance, and this mysterious investor was his last hope. His partners were equally eager, pacing nervously or adjusting their ties as they waited. "They should be here any moment," Richard said, glancing at his watch. His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed a slight tremor. The door swung open, and a representative for the investor stepped inside. She was a composed woman in a sharp business suit, carrying a thick folder. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said, setting the folder on the table. "Before the principal arrives, I'd like to review a few terms of the proposed agreement." Richard nodded, his nerves starting to fray. "Course. But when will the investor be here?" "I'd like to meet them personally." "They'll be joining us shortly," the representative replied with a slight smile. She began outlining the terms, and as she spoke, Richard's partners exchanged wary glances. The terms were firm, almost unyielding, with clauses that gave the investor substantial control over the firm's operations. Meanwhile, Emma sat in the back of a chauffeured car parked just outside the building. Her heart pounded as the driver opened the door for her. She stepped out, adjusting her understated but elegant dress. She had spent years preparing for this moment, and now it was finally here. As she walked toward the building, she thought of all the dinners, gatherings, and private moments when she had swallowed her pride to maintain peace. Today, she would no longer remain silent. Today, she would reclaim her voice. Back in the conference room, tension was rising. Richard's patience was wearing thin as he pressed the representative for answers. "I need to know who I'm dealing with here," he said, his voice clipped. "We can't agree to anything until we meet the investor." As if on cue, the door opened once more, and Emma stepped inside. The room fell silent. Richard's eyes widened in disbelief as he stared at his wife, standing confidently in the doorway. "Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing here?" She walked to the head of the table, her gaze unwavering. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "I believe you've been waiting for me." The shock in the room was palpable. Richard stumbled over his words. What is this? You're the investor." Emma's lips curved into a faint smile. "That's correct. Over the past few years, I've quietly acquired a majority stake in this firm. I've been following its progress closely, and I must say, the results have been illuminating." Richard's mind raced, the weight of her revelation crashing down on him. "You've been investing in the firm. Why didn't you tell me?" Emma tilted her head slightly. "You never asked. Besides, you and your family made it very clear what you thought of me and my small and insignificant career. I saw no reason to share my ambitions with people who dismissed them so easily." One of Richard's partners, a middle-aged man named Peter, broke the silence. "Wait, you're saying you own the majority of the firm?" Emma nodded. "That's correct. As of this moment, I hold the controlling interest. And I have some ideas about how to move forward." Richard's face turned red, a mixture of anger and humiliation. "Emma, this is ridiculous. You can't just walk in here and take over. Emma's expression hardened. I'm not just walking in. I've been investing, analyzing, and planning for years. This isn't impulsive, it's calculated. And unlike you, I don't dismiss people based on their job titles. The meeting turned into chaos as Richard's partners scrambled to process the revelation. Some were impressed by Emma's boldness, while others were visibly unnerved by the shift in power. Emma remained composed, her years as a kindergarten teacher giving her the patience to handle unruly behavior with grace. I understand this is unexpected, she said, addressing the room. But I want to assure you that my goal is to strengthen this firm. I believe in its potential, even if some of its members have yet to meet that potential. Her words were measured, but Richard felt the sting of her subtle jab. He leaned forward, his voice low and tense. You think you can just waltz in here and tell us what to do? Emma met his gaze without flinching. I think I can, Richard. Because I'm the one who saved this firm when it was on the brink of collapse. I'm the one who believed in its future when no one else did. And now I'm the one in charge. The meeting ended with Emma setting clear terms for her involvement, leaving no room for negotiation. Richard and his family were left reeling, their confidence shaken. For the first time in years, Emma felt the weight of their judgment lift from her shoulders. As she walked out of the conference room, her phone buzzed. It was a text from one of her students' parents, thanking her for the impact she had on their child's life. Emma smiled, her dual roles as teacher and investor intertwining in a way that felt deeply fulfilling. She glanced back at the building one last time before stepping into her car. The game had changed, and Emma was no longer a passive player. The days following the shocking revelation were filled with tension at the Bennett household. Richard's usual air of superiority was replaced with uncertainty and frustration. He avoided Emma, retreating into his study or working late at the office, grappling with the new reality. The firm he had once confidently declared as his own was now under the control of the woman he had belittled for years. Emma, however, remained calm. She carried on with her work at the kindergarten, her days filled with the joyful chaos of children learning and growing. But when she returned home in the evenings, she shifted into her role as the firm's majority shareholder, attending meetings, reviewing documents, and making decisions that steered the company toward stability. At the next board meeting, Emma faced Richard and the other partners with the same quiet strength she had shown before. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken resentment and curiosity. Some of the partners had begun to admire Emma's decisiveness, while others struggled to reconcile the image of the humble kindergarten teacher with the sharp, strategic investor now sitting at the head of the table. Let's get started, Emma said, her tone firm but approachable. She laid out a plan to restructure the firm, streamline operations, and prioritize ethical practices, something that had been sorely lacking under Richard's leadership. As she spoke, Richard couldn't help but feel a pang of shame. For years, he had dismissed her as unambitious, yet here she was, commanding the room with a level of poise and intelligence that he couldn't ignore. Later that evening, as they sat in the living room, Richard finally broke the silence. Emma, he began, his voice softer than she'd heard in years. I had no idea you were capable of all this. Emma looked up from her book, her expression neutral. No, Richard. You had no interest in finding out. You and your family made your opinions of me very clear. I was the silly little kindergarten teacher, right? Too small-minded to understand the world you live in. He winced at her words. I was wrong. I can see that now. Emma set her book down and met his gaze. I didn't do this to prove you wrong. I did this because I believed in myself, even when you didn't. And because I believed in the firm's potential, even when you were too focused on your own ego to see it. Richard looked away, guilt etched across his face. What happens now? That's up to you, Emma replied. But let me make one thing clear. I won't tolerate the kind of arrogance and dismissal I've dealt with for years. If you want to stay in this marriage, or at this firm, you'll need to show the same respect you expect from others." In the weeks that followed, Emma's influence over the firm grew. She introduced new policies that emphasized transparency and fairness, winning over even the most skeptical partners. The firm's reputation began to recover, and clients who had been on the fence returned with renewed confidence. At home, Richard struggled to adapt to his new reality. He found himself re-evaluating the way he viewed Emma, and himself. He began to notice the small things he had once overlooked. Her resilience, her ability to connect with people, her quiet determination. Slowly, he started to support her, not just as a businesswoman but as a partner. Months later, at a gala celebrating the firm's turnaround, Emma stood at the podium, addressing a crowd of clients, partners, and investors. Richard watched from the audience, a mixture of pride and regret swelling in his chest. "I've always believed," Emma said, her voice clear and steady, "that success isn't just about ambition or power. It's about impact. It's about using your strengths to create something meaningful, something that lasts. And sometimes, it's about finding the courage to believe in yourself when no one else does." The room erupted in applause as Emma stepped down from the stage. She had become the face of the firm's transformation, her story inspiring not only those within the company but others who had followed her journey. As the night wound down, Richard approached Emma, his expression earnest. "You've done something incredible," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Emma studied him for a moment before nodding. "It's not too late to start seeing it now." And with that, the dynamic between them began to shift. Richard learned to appreciate Emma not as the woman he thought she should be, but as the extraordinary woman she had always been. Years later, Emma's story became a symbol of quiet strength and resilience. She continued teaching at the kindergarten, balancing her love for education with her role as an influential business leader. The firm thrived under her guidance, and Richard, humbled by the experience, became one of her staunchest supporters. In the end, Emma proved that success isn't always about shouting the loudest or taking up the most space. Sometimes it's about quietly building your own path, until the world has no choice but to take notice. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story and tell us where you're watching from.